Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the 2024 presidential election, but specifically the polls. We'll be talking about the electoral maps we're going to get from these polls and broadly why they've moved towards Kamala Harris. So just to take a look where we are right now, as of today, August 9th, Kamala Harris has a lead of 2% nationally. She's at 45.4%, Donald Trump 43.4%. And this is a significant change because even if you go back 2 weeks ago, to the middle of July, say, July 25th, Harris was kind of a dead heat. She was up by 0.2 on the 26th, 0.4 on the 25th. So she was kind of below 1%, in July. And then once we hit August, she really began to surge even more. So on August 1st, she took a lead of about 1.2%, and that has, continued to expand pretty consistently as we've seen over the course of these past few days as we've gotten more and more into the month of August. So right now, let's look at the recent polling. RMG Research, Harris up by one, or really she's tied in their LV screen. That's the better one, so she's tied there. Ipsos has her up by 5, and then they push them aside. She's up by 2. YouGov, she's up by 2. ActiVote, she's up by 1. And then she's up by 3 in Survey USA. 4 in Morning Consult. Marist is a poll that I really like. She's up by 3 there. CNBC had her down by 2, which was interesting. Kind of one of the only polls that shows Trump still winning. Tip Insights has her up by 2. YouGov up by 2 last week. And then, again, we already saw them this week. They showed no change. Marquette, though, this is a really good poll. The A+ rating for 538. She's up by 8 nationally there when you push undecided voters. And then in their other screen, they have her up by 6 nationally, both of which would be pretty, big victories for her. We'll talk about whether or not I believe that number in a second here, but she's up by a lot in Marquette. RMG had her up by 5, so this is, I think, one of the worst polls for her because it showed a shift towards Trump since last week, while most polls showed a shift towards Harris. YouGov keeps showing her up by 2. Civic, she's up by 4, and then Morning Consult had her up by 1. And so that's kind of the past 2 weeks summarized here. And she's leading in all but one poll. Then she's obviously tied in the most recent RMG survey. But let's just go back to before Biden dropped out. He dropped out on July 21st. Let's look at the polls in the days leading up to that. If you look at your screen, Biden didn't lead in a single national poll. Not a single one. YouGov, they show Harris up by 2 now. Trump was up by 2. Quinnipiac shows Harris up. Trump was in, once they pushed undecided voters, he was up by 2. Harris, not affiliated with Kamala Harris, Harris X Forbes partner, Trump was up by 8 there. And they have since then, I believe, pulled, actually, no, they haven't pulled Harris. Or no, they have pulled Harris versus Trump, and they, in early July, they had Harris down by 3. So they did show a shift towards Harris, although it is definitely her worst poll at this point in time. And then, you look at some of the other polls we've already talked about. YouGov had Trump up by 3 and 5. They now show Harris with the lead. RMG, Harris up by 1 as of this morning. Trump's up by 5. Or he was up by 5, rather. So every poll was showing Trump beating Biden. And now the vast majority of them show Trump losing to Kamala Harris. And so this is really interesting. There has been a shift in this race. And, let's talk about it. Let's talk about the polls, because the polls are really important. And again, a lot of people, just to kind of give my opinion on the polls, I don't love the polls. I think generally to look at the polls, you have to, or to do accurately, you have to kind of know broadly what to expect. So, for example, in 2022, a lot of polls showed Democrats until September and October winning the Ohio Senate race. Now, if you watch my channel back then, I never moved that race down from likely Republican, even though the polls showed it to be a Democratic-leaning race. Why did I not move it? Simple, because in Ohio, for example, the polls had a history that was very, very clear of overestimating Democratic support and underestimating Republican support. And in those polls, Democrats were leading. Tim Ryan, the Democrat, was leading, rather, but he was never at 50% of the vote. He was at 45, maybe 46%, and J.D. Vance is at 39 or 40%. And so what I said in those videos was J.D. Vance is going to win the undecided voters by a big margin. He's going to win the race by 5 or 6 on election day, and that's what happened. And so, you have to look at the polls and you have to view them fairly. But you also have to incorporate, in my opinion, a lot of people don't agree with this, but you have to incorporate your priors, because you have to be able to weed out polling that doesn't make any sense. In 2022, there are many examples, and there were even more extreme examples. There were polls that showed John Fetterman winning in Pennsylvania by 20 points, but there were also polls that showed Republicans down by 7 points in Vermont, a Senate race they lost by, I think, 40 on election day. So you have to look at the polls, but you also have to look at them, with a bit of knowledge, and that's, at least a bit of in an understanding of what's possible and what's not possible. So if today a poll came out of Tennessee and showed Kamala Harris down by 2, I would not think about it that much. The same way that if a poll came out today and showed Donald Trump winning the popular vote by 17, I would also not think about it that much. So I just want to get that out of the way. That's how I approach polls. And broadly, none of these polls are that extreme. The most extreme poll we've gotten was the Harris +8 poll from Marquette. And I'll talk about that later in this video. But even that, I wouldn't say is super out of the question. It's definitely an outlier, but it isn't so extreme that I'd throw it out, of the average necessarily. And then we also have to talk about the, argument of response bias. So, the concept of response bias is that polling will always directionally be correct, not because it's, necessarily good at measuring the sentiment of the electorate, but because if your party is winning, if they have the momentum, you're more likely to respond to a poll. So let's say you were a Democrat 5 weeks ago, and everyone knew Joe Biden was losing, or at least was a clear underdog, right? You were a lot less likely to respond to a poll because you were less energized, or you didn't care as much about the election, or you weren't necessarily as locked in with your vote. Whereas now, if you're a Democrat and Kamala Harris has the clear momentum in this election, and Democrats, are a lot more united behind her than they were in the final weeks of the Biden campaign, you're a lot more likely to respond to that poll. And so what's happened is we've gotten samples, compare them to 3 or 4 weeks ago, that had Donald Trump voters responding at a higher rate, or Republicans responding at a higher rate. And now it's Democrats that respond at a slightly higher rate. So yeah, in that, naturally in that way, there has been kind of this swing in the polls that inherently will benefit Democrats and will benefit Kamala Harris. Now, that only to an extent explains the swing, because if you look at polls, they will usually ask, on top of asking for the Harris versus Trump matchup, who would you vote for if it were still Biden versus Trump? And the Marquette Harris +8 poll did that. They had Harris up by 8, and they had Biden up by 1. Now, Biden up by 1 would have been an outlier the day before he dropped out, because again, he was down. I showed you these polls, back at the, on July 20th, for example. Let's go back here. That would have been an outlier, because Trump was down by so much in the final days, Trump was up by so much in the final days of the Biden campaign. So if we had a poll that showed Biden up by 1, that would have been an outlier. But it's still a 7-point improvement for Kamala Harris over Joe Biden. So in that sample, they have Harris doing 7% better nationally than they had Biden doing. So unless you think Biden was going to lose by 7 nationally, which no matter how bad it got for Biden, I don't think that would have been remotely close to being possible. Harris still would lead in that specific poll. So that's just an example of how response bias does kind of affect polls. So maybe the poll would have been Harris +6 and not Harris +8. But even then, that's still a very good poll for her. You have to remember that when you look at these polls. So those are my broad thoughts. That explains like 10% of the shift. But the majority of the shift is, just the fact that Joe Biden was a bad candidate. Right? Joe Biden was underperforming fundamentals. He was not, he was unpopular, but not necessarily the way past presidents have been unpopular, right? He wasn't scandal plagued. We aren't in a recession. We don't have a major issue that people can identify with his presidency, aside from the fact that he personally is very old. That was the problem. That was the problem for Democrats. Americans were not comfortable voting for an 82-year-old man to be president until he was 86. And that's really what it was. So, Kamala Harris kind of inherently takes that away, because she's 59, I believe, and not 82. She's a full 23 years or 22 years younger than Joe Biden. So that kind of fixes itself. And you also have to remember that, again, Democrats are more enthused about Harris. When you look at these polls, compare them to June or July, Democrats are a lot, Democrats, a higher percentage of them say they're excited to vote, or that they are guaranteed to vote, than they did when Biden was the nominee. So enthusiasm definitely plays a role, and just the overall electability, running someone who's not 81, 82 really helps Democrats, obviously. And so that kind of explains why Kamala Harris has taken the lead in the polls, I think. It's because of the electability shift, because she's not 82. It's because of enthusiasm. It's also in part a little bit because of response bias. So let's talk about the map. Now, if you apply, so Harris is up by 2. If you apply a 2.5 point swing from 2020, the map would actually be pretty good for Trump, because he'd be winning all his 2020 states. I'm going to fill this. I really should have done this before the video, but I'll talk while I do it. So he'd be winning all his 2020 states, right? And I'm not going to do margins here because I don't want to think about that. But if you give Trump all his 2020 states, he would be right about here. No, he'd be there. He'd be there. 235 electoral votes, right? And then if every state that voted for Biden by under 2.5 points swung to Trump, you'd be red Nevada, red Arizona, red Wisconsin, red Pennsylvania, red Georgia, And yeah, so Trump would win 297 electoral votes. Kamala Harris would win all the Hillary Clinton 2016 states minus Nevada, plus Nebraska District 2, and plus Michigan. So she'd still be winning Michigan, which is important to think about. But this is what the map would look like, right? Like Trump would win. But we have to remember that the Electoral College doesn't necessarily reflect the popular vote the same way every election. Barack Obama won the popular vote by 1.5 points less than Joe Biden, and he won a lot more states. He won, not only did he win Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Nevada by more. To be fair, he did lose Arizona and Georgia, but he won Iowa by a lot. He won Ohio, and he also won Florida. So this would be the modern day Obama versus Romney electoral map, plus Maine District 2, if you applied it to Kamala versus Trump. So again, Obama won the popular vote by a lot less than Joe Biden, and he still won the election by more, and his margins across different states were significantly greater. So that is kind of what we have to remember. So a 2-point popular vote victory for Harris, I think, would make the election a very clear toss-up. I think if Harris won the popular vote by exactly 2%, I think I might pick Trump to win just based off that. But if she won by 2.5, maybe 2.7, I think she'd win. And why do I say that? Well, because in 2022, Democrats lost the House popular vote by 1.6% when you adjust for, because obviously, if you have a district where no Democrat runs and it's uncontested, you have to account for that. And so they lost it by, I think, 2.7%. When you adjust for that, they lost it by 1.6%. So that's the real baseline here. And they came within like a couple thousand votes across 5 House seats from winning majority. So in terms of how the popular vote reflected the actual result, Democrats in 2022 did better, whereas Democrats in 2020 did worse than you would have expected. So this year, we have evidence that Kamala Harris is going to do better than Biden in 2020. Why? Well, because she might decrease in the popular vote because she wouldn't necessarily net as many votes out of California or New York, and she'll be less competitive in Florida. But she polls better than Biden in the swing states. And if you look at some of these states, right, let's go to, say, Michigan, which is a state that she would narrowly win if she won by 2. She's up by a point there. Or no, she's up by a point in Pennsylvania. I thought I clicked on Michigan. She's up by 2 in Michigan. And then you go to Wisconsin, which is the other key state here. She's also up there by 1.8. So she's up in all 3 Rust Belt states. And in Arizona and Georgia, she's down by 0.4, I believe, in Arizona. So those states are pure toss-ups. And again, if you believe the polls and if you give these states to Kamala Harris, she would be at exactly 270 electoral votes. I think actually Nevada, I'm not sure who's leading there. We'll take a look at that, and we'll apply that in 1 second here. Nevada, we don't have an average yet, but it looks like Trump would narrowly still have a lead. So if you believe the national polls and you shift it from 2020, Trump would win. But if you believe the state polls, you get a very narrow victory for Kamala Harris. And so that's important to note because the national polls have showed Harris. Some of them like Marquette have Trump doing worse than 2020, but most of them, on average, they show Trump doing better than 2020 nationally in terms of the popular vote. Again, he's down by 2% here, which is an improvement from 2020 where he lost by 4.45%. But again, the state polls do not show that. The state polls do not show this shift towards Trump that would be reflected in the national popular vote. They show Harris doing better than Biden in Wisconsin, a little worse in Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So that's where the polls are right now. It's pretty clear to me we're in a close election. I would not really buy any argument for a clear Trump favorite, for Trump being the clear favorite or for Harris being the clear favorite. But I think right now, I just broadly, I think right now it's very close. It's very, very close. And the polls are good for Harris. They could be better. If she takes a 3-point lead, I'll definitely think that at least she's a narrow favorite, clearly. If she takes a 4-point lead, we're approaching 2020 territory. If it's more, we're approaching clear victory territory. But let's say the polls shift to Trump. If it goes back to a tie, if Harris's numbers decrease, Trump's back to the favorite. And if he starts taking a lead in the popular vote polls by like 1-2 points, he's back to the clear favorite. So at this point in time, it's very close. And I'll keep you posted on how those polls change and how to interpret them. So be sure to subscribe. Let me know what you think about the polls. And always, as always, feel free to suggest new videos. But with that, I'll see you all in the next one.